Augsti godātais prezidenta kungs, cienītie Saeimas deputāti, ekscelences vēstnieki, dāmas un kungi. Man ir patiess prieks, ka šodien mums notiks jau 3. lekcija prezidenta lasījuma ciklā Latvijas Universitātē pasaules līderi. Mani kolēģi statistiķi parasti saka, ka statistika sākās no 3. Es domāju, ka mēs varētu teikt, ka tradīcija arī sākās no 3. Un tādēļ es gribētu teikt, ka šoreiz es jau varu teikt ar pilnu atbildību, ka šie jau ir tradicionālie prezidenta lasījumi Latvijas Universitātē. Mr. President, honorable members of Parliament, Excellencies, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. I am very happy to welcome all of you to the University of Latvia, to the lectures of President of Latvia at the University of Latvia. My colleagues from statistics, from science, usually are telling that statistics starts with 3. I believe that we can equally well say that tradition starts with 3. And it means that this is already a traditional lecture of our president at the University of Latvia. This is the 3rd lecture. We remember 2 previous lectures, which were both very remarkable and very interesting. I'm more than sure that this one will be equally interesting and enlightening to everybody who is present here. And now I would like to invite our president, Valdis Zatlers, to introduce our speaker. Un tagad es gribētu lūgt mūsu valsts prezidentu iepazīstināt mūs ar šīs dienas lektoru. Lūdzu.
Augstgadātais rektora kungs, cienījamās dāmas, godātie kungi, godātie mācību spēki, protams, godātie studenti. Šis lekciju cikls, kā esam to iecerējis, ir kā lekcijas cikls par mūsdienu pasauli, kurā mēs visi esam savstarpēji atkarīgi, savstarpēji viens otru ietekmējam un, protams, ļoti, ļoti komunicējam. Šajā dažādajā pasaulē, kur dažbrīd mums liekas, ka šis epicentrs ir tieši mūsu personā, mūsu universitātē vai mūsu valstī, bet patiesībā epicentra nav. Mēs esam vienā tā pasaulē visi kopā, kā daļa no kaut kā lielāka. Un tāpēc, manuprāt, ir ļoti būtiski uzzināt viedokļus, kas ir varbūt atšķirīgi, kas varbūt ir soli priekšā mūsu tieši šodienas izpratnē par to, kā mēs veidosim savu nākotni, un kļūt pašiem radošiem. Un tāpēc man šodien ir liels prieks, kad mans viesis ir tāda projekta kā Radošā Lielbritānija veidotājs. Ja arī mums šeit ir daži projekti, Latvija 2020, 30 un varbūt mēs vēl tālāk. Un arī mēs paši ļoti bieži runājam par radošumu kā virzošu spēku, vai varbūt ar radošumu kā resursu, uz kā pamata veidot mūsu valstu. Un tāpēc man priecīgi ir paziņot, ka šīs dienas lekcijas nosaukumā radošums ir minēts 2 reizes, kā radoša ekonomika, bet vēl būtiskāk, kā radoša pārvalde. Un šajā brīdī, kad mēs ejam reāli savas pārvaldes, savas ekonomikas un savas valsts pārstruktūrēšanai, varbūt radošums ir tā lieta, kas mums visvairāk ir nepieciešams. Un tāpēc man ir liels gods un privilēģija jūs iepazīstināt ar Džonu Ņūbiginu and Honorable Džona Ņūbigina. The floor is yours.
Well, Mr. President, and all of you who are here, thank you for coming to listen to what I have to say. I feel suitably humble, being the person who is responsible for turning a new idea into a tradition by being the 3rd lecturer in this series. I think that for the President to do this is a wonderful and innovative approach to presidency. It seems to me that I've worked in government and out of government in the UK, and in government sometimes it is very important to think the unthinkable, to think outside the box, to think lateral thoughts, and it's very difficult to continue to do that. It reminds me, Albert Einstein at a dinner at an American university was sitting next to the wife of a professor who was very nervous and didn't know what to talk to him about. And she said, Dr. Einstein, could you tell me what your new research program is about? To which Einstein replied, Madam, if I knew what I was doing, I would not call it research. And I think that sometimes it is important for governments and for policymakers to occasionally push themselves outside their comfort zone and think not necessarily unthinkable thoughts, but to think and try and see the world in a new way to help them inform their policy making. So what I want to talk about today is a little bit about the experience that we've had in the UK in developing creative industry policy over the last 12 or 13 years, but also to try and draw out some lessons for what I think are going to be hugely important issues for all of our societies in Europe over the next 10 or 15 years, way beyond the remit of the creative economy, to think about how we have more creative societies and what is the relationship between a new economic paradigm of creativity and the kind of government and the kind of systems of governments that we will need to realize the full potential of the changes that we're making. So I'm going to start very heretically with my 2-minute analysis of the economic history of the world. So this is for most of human history, this has been the key determinant of economic activity, just muscle power. If you wanted more economic activity, you got more arms. Now, of course, the limitation of arms is they're very good for digging, they're very good for building, very good for fighting, but they have their limitations. From the Industrial Revolution onwards, you could say that the key determinant of economic activity became money. Whether it was in a capitalist system or a non-capitalist system, the accumulation of capital to build big units of production was the key determining issue in the way that the economy developed. So big economies, on the whole, did better than small economies, and the process of rapid capital accumulation became the key determinant of economic success. But of course, the limitation with this is that if money is the driver in that way, then the only determinant of success is growth. And if we're now moving into a time when there are so many of us, and we've already exhausted the resources of this planet to such an extent that that conventional understanding of growth no longer makes sense, we have to think about other ways of how we are going to sustain economic activity which generates the value that means that all of us and our children and the 8 or 9 billion people who are going to be living on this planet in 50 years' time have some prospect and some opportunity of looking forward to success. So my argument is that we're now moving into a time when creativity becomes the key determinant of economic activity. And of course, as soon as you start saying the brain rather than the arm is deciding what's going on, you are breaking the bounds of traditional definitions of economic activity. You're talking about culture, you're talking about social change, you're talking about solidarity, you're talking about fun, you're talking about love, all kinds of things. So the conventional boundaries of what determines economic activity begin to alter. And some of the key issues which are beginning to be thrown up by the creative economy and the creative industries are that many of the people who are the most effective and entrepreneurial workers in these new areas of the economy, many of them don't really regard themselves as working in business at all. They may be pursuing some artistic project, they may be pursuing some project of social activism. They don't conform to the way in which governments conventionally interact with business. In the UK, a study done in one part of the country of digital media entrepreneurs found that 90% of them did not regard themselves as primarily as business people, but they are running very important businesses. So if, in terms of public policy, governments are to engage with these people, we have to think about different ways of doing it. Secondly, I think it's a mistake to think of the creative economy in the way that many people do, which is simply products, films, music, animation, digital media, fashion, and so on. We're also talking about processes. And a key part of changing the way our economy works is to be thinking in terms of process rather than products. And one of the ways in which the creative economy is changing the way all our economies work is on a business-to-business basis. In other words, some of the most creative functions in our society, which do have cultural roots, and I'm talking about advertising and marketing, human resource management, these things are increasingly determinants of what happens elsewhere in the economy, the areas of the economy we don't particularly think of as creative. And so, as we go through this change, what you can say is that an economy which is based on creativity in this way is going to have implications for every other aspect of the economy. So here is something which the European Commission Directorate General produced earlier this year. The creative industries are not only an important economic factor in themselves, they also fuel the rest of the economy with knowledge and dynamism. In other words, these small industries, although in a sense they're not all that significant yet, in the UK they account for about 8%, 10% of the economy. They are growing at a very, very rapid rate, but their influence is spreading out into the rest of the economy, and they are the beginnings of a transformation. They're yeast in the dough, if you like, which are beginning to transform the way our economies work into a system which is based on a different paradigm. And the other thing which I think we very easily forget in Europe is that this is a worldwide phenomenon. It's happening in all parts of the world and happening almost in equal measure. In fact, in Asia and in Latin America and in parts of Africa, there are policymakers and certainly bankers, investors, entrepreneurs who are trying to engage with this creativity agenda at least as energetically as we are in Europe. So here's another quote. Oh. Wrong quote, my mistake, sorry. Hang on. Okay, I will move on. The quote which I thought was going to come up there is from UNCTAD, the United Nations Commission for Trade and Development. And UNCTAD argues that what is happening with the growth of the creative economy is not only changing the way economies work, but it's also beginning to change the way in which societies fundamentally work. And so I just want to go through one or two areas of those global change which I think lend emphasis to the importance of the creative economy. This is, as you can tell, I'm sure, is a picture of New York. 50, 60 years ago, New York was probably the biggest city in the world and was certainly regarded as the coolest city in the world. Now it's a small city. There are many cities in China, in Central America, in Asia, where there are populations 2 or even 3 times that of New York. We're in a society now where 50% of the world's people are urbanized, whereas 100 years ago it was about 10%. And what that means is that 50% of the world's people are, in some senses, in the cash economy, and almost 50% of the people in the world are also in an electronic economy. However poor they are, they feel themselves to be part of that economy and engaging with that economy, and therefore they have different aspirations. Once they have taken care of the absolute basics of food and shelter, they become interested in cultural opportunities, they become interested in cultural artifacts, and that is one of the key determinants of growth in the creative economy. What's more, it's reckoned that by 2030, 80% of the world's city dwellers will be living in what we call the developing world. So, in other words, the huge markets for creative goods and creative services are going to be in the developing world. And this is one of the key means by which we exchange cultural information to each other in our society. So how we play into this huge global market is of immense significance to our European economies and European societies. I talked about aspiration. Now this is, even the small goldfish likes to move from a small bowl into a big bowl. But there's also a different kind of aspiration, and that is that people, once they have taken care of their basic food and shelter, want to have a more fulfilling economic life as well. And as we all know, we're moving into a time when manufacturing is less and less the key part of economic activity, in this sense that manufacturing can be moved wherever labor costs are cheapest. So a factory may be in Europe today, it'll be in China tomorrow, it may be in Indonesia the day after. Where the key part of the value chain comes is in the creative spark, in the idea, in the process, which is beginning to drive what happens further down the chain in manufacturing. So in relative terms, manufacturing becomes less valuable, creative energy becomes more valuable. And one of the phenomena around the world is that particularly young people are passionately interested about being involved in the creative industries. In the UK, around 30% of graduates say that they want to work in the creative economy in some shape or form. But as we conventionally define creative activities at the moment, only 10 or 11% can do so. So there's a great demand for people to be able to engage creatively in what they're doing. And I think one of the things about the creative economy is that it is not, again, restricted to conventional forms of economic activity. So the distinction between consumer and producer begins to break down. If you have an iPhone, and I'm sure many of you have, I mean, this is a phone, and it's very useful as a phone, but it's also a tool on which I can create anything I want. I was in a cafe the other day with some kids who were editing a film on their iPhones. So we're creating a world in which what have been in the past seen as consumer objects are becoming tools for creativity. And whether it's the way in which people earn their income or whether it's the way they express themselves in personality terms, they have the aspiration to be engaged in a more creative way. And if we're not able to offer opportunities for people to fulfill that creative aspiration, then of course what happens is that it leads to frustration. Now, another key issue, which I've already touched on, is that the conventional economic paradigm is beginning to run out of steam. We know that we cannot sustain a world which consumes energy, more hydrocarbon energy, in the way that we have in the past. The only way we are going to be able to maintain a planet on which there is a real opportunity for quality of life and there is some possibility for people to live a fulfilled life is if we find more creative ways of creating value. I mean, sometimes this has been called the weightless economy, in the sense that it's the idea that has value, not the product that has value. And if we are not able to find ways of engaging creatively with activities that we've undertaken traditionally, then we have a very limited future. And that is why, although we may talk about the creative industries as a fairly narrow range of industries, to talk about creativity in the economy is a much, much bigger issue. And it means being engaged with every aspect of activity. From, you start with the most basic of human activities, farming, climate change, the beginnings of understanding about genetic manipulation, the spread of pesticides, pressure on resources, pressure on water. All these things are driving a more creative engagement with agriculture than has ever been necessary before. We can't go on building car factories in the way that we have for the last 100 years, but that doesn't mean that we can't build cars or means of personal transport, but we have to be really creative in thinking about how we're going to accommodate them in cities and how we're going to power them so that we're not depleting the Earth's resources. So environmental degradation and resource depletion is one of the key drivers that is driving the creative economy, but also forcing us to think more creatively. Because if you think about it, other resources are depleted as they're used. Knowledge and creativity are resources that grow the more they are used and the more they are shared. And that makes them quite unlike any other resource that we've had in the past. Now, this is another statistic from UNCTAD. The world economy is growing very fast, but at differential rates. UNCTAD identified this as the rate of growth in what they call creative goods and services. This is an astonishing rate of growth on a global level to sustain over 5 years, and it continued after 2005 until 2008. So it's simply a statement of the fact that this area of activity is going to become more and more important, and we must make it more and more important, and therefore we have to manage our societies and our education services and our governance in ways that lead us towards the creative solutions to the problems that we have. So let me go on and talk about some of the key practical issues that governments are trying to address. Education is obviously the place to start. This looks like a very happy class of kids. They all know the answer to the question. You could say that means that nobody is learning anything, because they do already know the answer to the question. It's a very, very traditional way of organizing education. And if you think about it, our education systems, almost everywhere in the world, are still designed for basically a 19th century economy, in this sense that when the key determinants of economic activity were mass manufacturing production, we needed to have an education system which taught timekeeping, discipline, the ability to do repetitive work, the separation of different functions. All those things were a very legitimate part of having a skilled, trained labor force. But we're now moving into a time when it is much more important for people to be able to work together collaboratively, for people to feel that they have some creative engagement in what they're doing, for people to learn how to converge skills that traditionally have been separate. And the paradigm of education that we've got is not in any way leading us towards the kind of outcomes that will enable us to build that sort of economy. So in the UK, where we have been experimenting for some years with trying to instill a different kind of solution in the education system, and we've been having discussions earlier in the day about this. I think it's very easy to stand up and say the education system we've had is not relevant to the world as it is today. To begin to change an education system is a hugely complicated function, because nobody wants to have their children used as some social experiment that may go wrong. And of course, in that sense, education is always going to be a conservative, or the education system is always likely to be a very conservative institution. But one of the things that we found in Britain is that to begin to introduce creativity in and around the classroom in different ways, from a very early age right through to higher education, is a way of changing the paradigms with which children work. So they learn to collaborate, they learn to engage with their partners in activities that they're undertaking. And I think that in other areas too, we have a program in the UK of trying to disseminate effectively new learning technologies in schools. And of course, what comes across very clearly in that is that where there is a strong sense of leadership in a school, where the teachers and the head teacher in particular understands the purpose and value of what is going on, then it is possible to change. Where teachers have got real clear support in using new technology and new ideas, they can change. Where children have the opportunity to engage in practical activity which has a real impact in the real world, they learn far more than if they're doing theoretical exercises which are just for them and their teacher. And I'll give you a very small practical example of an organization that I'm involved in. We give money to children to make films, short films. Now, a very small number of these kids go on to find work in the film industry, but what they gain from that experience is teamwork, discipline, how to construct a story, how to construct a narrative, and they learn skills which are going to be enormously useful for them in their life, whether they choose to go into the film industry or not. And engaging creative thinking in the classroom does lead to a very different kind of outcome. And I just want to have this quotation here is from the Education Inspectorate in the UK, in England, looking at a program which my colleague Paul Collard here was closely involved in, of introducing creative professionals to work in the classroom with young people alongside teachers, and particularly with some of the most disaffected young people, who are the people who are going to find it most difficult to get employment in a new creative skilled economy. The impact of those creative professionals working with them was enormous, and you can see, I won't bother to read it out, but you can see the changes in aspiration and expectation of some of those young people proved to be absolutely extraordinary and extraordinarily powerful. Now, another area of huge significance for government is, in terms of getting new creative paradigms going in the economy, is digital infrastructure. And again, this is something which we sort of take for granted in Europe, but around the world, economies and societies are recognizing that if they are to engage with the new economy, they need to be thinking about digital infrastructure. 2 or 3 examples. In Rwanda, in Central Africa, which is a very mountainous country, the cost of building roads is enormously high, and the government in Rwanda has decided that the best investment in communications infrastructure is not to build roads, they are building roads, but to build a broadband infrastructure throughout Rwanda. Starting from next year, they're proposing to give every school child in Rwanda a laptop. Now, you may say that for a very poor country in Central Africa, this is crazy. Their argument is, and they brought in a lot of Korean expertise to help them build this, because the Koreans have done more to build effective digital infrastructure than any other economy, and they're beginning to reap the benefits. I'll go on to talk about that in a minute. But they see that it is cheaper to build this infrastructure and to give every child in the country a laptop than to build conventional highways. And already in Rwanda, what's happening is they are creating programs which teach dairy farmers how to deal with particular diseases in their cattle, which have always been a problem. Every village that has a laptop, solar powered because there's no electricity, farmers who may be completely illiterate are learning new techniques of animal care and animal husbandry through the internet. Their proposal in Rwanda is to make Rwanda the commercial capital of Central Africa. Nobody's competing for that job. There's plenty of other things going on in Central Africa, but not much like that. Now, if a country like that can do it, what are the possibilities that we should be thinking about in Europe? But also, what is the competition that we're going to face globally in 15 or 20 years' time? I'll give you another little example. An academic in Bangladesh, Muhammad Yunus, some of you may have heard of him. He's won the Nobel Prize. He had a cleaner who was cleaning his office, was very distressed. He said, "Why are you distressed?" She owed $5 US. There was no way on her wage that she could repay this loan of $5 US. He thought to himself, this is crazy. Why can't she borrow the money? There was nowhere she could borrow the money because no bank would do business with somebody who was so poor. So he said, I'm going to start a bank. And he's going to turn his bank upside down. He said, this is a design job. I will do the opposite of every bank in Bangladesh. All the existing banks had their branches in the city centres. He said, I'll only build branches in the villages where no bank has ever been before. He noticed, he said, in a very conservative society like that, the banks lent money to men. He said, I will only lend money to women. He also realized, and as we all know, when you go to a bank, what the bank wants to know is what you've done in the past with your money. He said, I'm not going to ask any questions about what you've done in the past. I'm only going to ask you questions about the future, what you're going to do with the money that you borrow from me. This now has 56 million customers and is probably the most successful bank in Bangladesh, and it has transformed economies in rural areas of Bangladesh. On the basis of this, he had another idea, which was that in each village where he has a branch of his bank, he lent 2 women the money to buy telephones. He said, you have to have 2 telephones because you have to have competition, otherwise they might be tempted to put the price up or only let their friends use the telephone. So, again, because there's no electricity in the villages, they're solar powered. And the result is he's now running the biggest telephone company in Bangladesh. He's completely leapfrogged almost a century of European telecommunications and gone straight to the future. That's going to happen more and more. That is, if you like, the delivery of a conventional service, but thought about in a very, very creative way. 2 or 3 other examples. There's a scheme called Kiva, which allows people in the developed world to invest in small businesses in the developing world. It's all done by mobile phones. It has only been running 2 or 3 years. It's now generating investment at the rate of something like $10 million a week. Another little example. There's a company in the US called Indiegogo, another equivalent company in the UK called Trampoline, and they do what they call crowdsourced financing. What they mean by that is, if you have an idea for investment, you put your idea up on their website. Anybody who's investing, and the typical investment is quite small, it's around $1,000. They have a series of competitions. All the investors in that scheme decide collectively by voting which they think are the 10 best schemes or the 5 best schemes, and all the money goes to them. So it's a kind of popular democratic control of investment in an area of the economy where conventional banks are very scared to go. And people invest for 2 reasons. One, because they want to get a return on their income, but also because they are interested in the social possibilities of these areas of investment. So most of them are social enterprises of one kind or another. So in all kinds of ways, this digital infrastructure is not simply a matter of being able to download movies, nice though that is. It is beginning to create whole areas of new economic activity. And in the UK, one of the issues which the government has woken up to, which I think is important and I actually think is quite visionary in a way that has not fully been appreciated yet, their argument is we have a huge amount of public information held in all kinds of different formats, the taxonomies, the navigation systems, the architecture, the electronic architecture that we've built for our digital resources militate against people having easy access to them. And the job of government is to make sure that all publicly available information is available as easily as it can be. And it's then the job of businesses to work out what they want to do with that information to develop marketable propositions from it. So they're not saying it's the role of government to develop the digital economy in any overarching sense. They say it is the role of government to maximize the opportunities that individual citizens and small entrepreneurs have to develop great business ideas out of the digital information base which we already have in our society and which is an extraordinarily rich one. So, as a statement of that, this Professor Stuart Cunningham is an Australian academic who's done a lot of very interesting work in the creative industries. South Korea's great surge of digital literacy and growth in both the household and the market sectors came on the back of many thousands thrown out of work by the Asian meltdown of the late 1990s. What he's saying is, when the South Korean economy crashed in the late 1990s, what happened, because there was already a digital infrastructure in place, people were able to grow new businesses on the back of that because the capacity was there, the communications infrastructure was there. And he went on to say that what happened was not just that businesses grew, but social use of the internet grew enormously. So people, again, this thing that breaking down the role between the customer, the consumer and the producer, what was happening was that social websites were beginning to develop in Korea. A whole new generation of people were engaging in internet and digital media in a way that previously had not been possible. And out of the economic crash came a completely different kind of economic activity, which is why, unarguably, South Korea is now leading the world in all kinds of key areas of digital media. Now I want to go on to talk about design, where I think I said that the key aspect of the creative economy is a business-to-business economy. I want to go on to talk about how government uses public money for good design in a moment. But this is probably too small for you to see, but this is a little example of how creative activity is changing the delivery of public services in the UK, and how the action of government and creative economy working together can create both a new system of governance and a new kind of economic activity. what happened was that the Design Council in Britain, working with arts graduates from the Royal College of Art, were given by government the brief to go into hospitals and redesign a lot of the equipment and services in hospitals to see if they could reduce infection. I don't know if the situation is the same in Latvia, but there's a group of bugs in UK, MRSA, we call it, which is almost immune to any kind of treatment and has killed quite a lot of people in hospitals. So the business of tackling infection in more and more sophisticated ways that it appears in hospitals is crucial. So the arts graduates didn't start by talking to the consultants with respect to your president. They started by talking to the hospital cleaners, because they thought the people who were doing the cleaning would understand where the problems lay. And of course the people who did the cleaning not only understood where the problems lay, but they also had ideas about the solutions. And by working with them, and also by working with patients who traditionally had not been involved in thinking about the design of hospitals, what's happened is that the Design Council has come up with a series of initiatives, some products, some processes, with a starting point of the dignity of the patient being paramount, because their argument was if the patient feels more secure about their dignity as a citizen when they're in hospital, and they're not being treated like a piece of meat that's being pushed from here to there, their health outcomes are likely to be better. They talked to the cleaners because they understood some of the basic problems, and they've come up with solutions which not only enhance patient dignity, they deliver better clinical outcomes, and they've reduced costs. So here's an example where the government, not by intervening directly, but simply by changing some of the rules of competition, have incentivized the engagement of creative people in finding solutions to problems which, for all our countries, at a time of economic downturn and financial constraint, mean that we have to be thinking very hard how we're going to deliver services more efficiently and more cost effectively. Now, it gets better than that, because the Design Council also came up with this remarkable figure. Now, we all know that statistics can tell as many lies as they do truths, but their point was that in the same way that if government engages in good design, it not only gets better outcomes, but it can reduce its costs. When business really engages with designers, you not only get better outcomes, you increase your turnover and you increase your profit. This is done on quite a big sample, so it's, I think it probably is pretty reliable statistics. And here's an even better one. They studied over 10 years 60 what they call design-intensive businesses. In other words, businesses that far more than normal took the issue of designing products and processes more seriously. So that does not mean just businesses doing dress design or furniture design or whatever, but sometimes very conventional businesses, transport businesses, distribution businesses, who thought through the design of their deployment, their operations, their human resources carefully, and they outperformed. The FTSE 100 is the stock exchange index of the 100 biggest companies in the UK economy. So these 64 design-intensive companies outperformed the 100 biggest companies in the UK. And again, I'm thinking, what is the relationship between the emerging paradigms of the creative economy and the kind of government that we need? Again, particularly at these times of financial constraint, there is absolutely no doubt that where design is really fully engaged in the processes of delivering public services as well as market goods, then huge benefits can result. Now, another area of activity which is common right across the world, but we have had some experience of it, particularly in the UK, is around planning in cities. Here again, what's the role of government and what's the role of the market in pushing forward a creative agenda? One of the truths of the creative industries seems to be that if you have a group of businesses, micro-businesses working together, they sustain each other, they support each other, they begin to develop networks of activity. This is nothing new. This is what been happening for hundreds of years in all our cities, traditional quarters where different groups of trades got together and worked. But in the industrial economy, we've perhaps forgotten the value of some of these mixed networks, which are professional networks and business networks, but also social networks. Small creative businesses, very often the relationships that they have are quite informal. Their best method of learning is from each other, so it's peer-to-peer support, as we call it, so they're learning from each other, exchanging ideas. They may be in competition, but they're also collaborating, and therefore if they're working together in a close geographical proximity, they increase the likelihood of their being able to work together effectively. A very small example, in Soho, in central London, a lot of small special effects companies working in the film industry wanted to bid for contracts for computer-generated sequences on big Hollywood movies. But if you're a Hollywood movie producer, you're not interested in some small company. You want to do a $20 million contract, get everything done in one go. These companies went to British Telecom, which is the main telecom provider in the UK, and said, build us a high-speed broadband network just around Soho, which is an area, it's maybe 1 square kilometre, tiny. This is 10 years ago. In an amazing outbreak of imagination for a telecoms company, because they're not always very imaginative, they built what they called SoHoNet, which was a dedicated high-speed broadband system just for these special effects companies. The result of that was that they could work together. They didn't abandon their small companies, they worked together collaboratively, and in consequence were able to bid for big contracts. As a result of that, a company called CFC Framestore came into existence. It is possibly the biggest special effects company in the world, and it's still based in Soho. Now, the point about that is that whereas in a traditional manufacturing economy, if you have a car factory in Latvia, but you can make the car cheaper in China, you can pick up the factory and put it in China. If you have a creative industry going in Riga, you can't pick it up and dump it in Hong Kong because it's grown out of the culture of this city and out of the culture of this country. So one of the most powerful elements in what's called clustering is that these culturally based businesses have cultural roots, and where cities are able to engage effectively and provide the kind of arts infrastructure, the social infrastructure, the cultural infrastructure, and of course cheap rents, flexible workspace, areas where things can be put on show, those are the areas where creative industries are most likely to grow and prosper. A couple of other things. One of the great truths in effective creative city clusters is diversity. Diversity of community, diversity of experience, diversity of knowledge. So it's not just academic knowledge, it's creative knowledge, management knowledge, and so on. A leading UK economist writing about this recently said, diversity is more important than ability in building a successful creative hub. Now, for me, coming here, been in Riga 48 hours, but I can see the history and traditions of this city are of diversity and openness. I mean, for good reasons and for bad, you've had to deal with a huge flow of different traditions and cultures through the city, and it's a port city. These are the kind of circumstances, and it's also a very attractive city. That's also important for creative entrepreneurs. They like places that are attractive, that have good clubs and pubs and places where people can meet. So the possibility of building creative hubs in a city like this seems to be much greater than is true of most other cities. That's a foolish thing for me to say when I've just arrived here, but it is an extraordinarily consistent phenomenon that diversity seems to be one of the fuels that helps to drive effective clusters of creative businesses, and that's something in which government at local and regional level, if not at national level, can help to ensure that the kind of infrastructure is there that enables that process to take place. And there's one other thing that seems to be very important in driving creative industry clusters, and that is a good education infrastructure, particularly at a higher education level, because these small, new, rapidly changing, rapidly growing micro-businesses need a constant pool of new labor, and they need to have educational institutions that are working with them to help develop the kind of skills that the local labor market needs. And one of the interesting things, which is abundantly true in the United Kingdom, and I think in other societies as well, is that very often it's not necessarily the university that has the greatest academic record, it's the university that is most open to new ideas and change and the ability to collaborate that can be the most effective support for creative industries in that region. And where you get a good, strong synergy going between university and local labour market, the results can be extraordinary. That's certainly true of many cities in China increasingly, but there's a small town in Scotland called Dundee, which is now home to one of the most dynamic electronic games industries in the world, purely because some graduates from that university 20 years ago liked the town, stayed in the town, set up a little games company, went back to the university, said, can we borrow your computers at the weekend because we can't afford the computer facilities that we need. They began to build a relationship with the university. The university began to develop specialist media digital science courses for them, and the two have grown in harmony. And on that point, there's an extraordinary phenomenon going on now where this process of convergence between traditional skills and traditional engineering skills and new economy skills is getting closer and closer. I was talking to somebody who is involved with Rolls-Royce in their aero engine division. He's an academic and is working on the next generation of airflow through jet turbines. A very, very high-end piece of research which is being conducted partly in the UK and partly in India. And he said to me that all the senior programmers that they're bringing onto this engineering program all come from the games industry. Because, he said, they are the only people who combine an understanding of pure mathematics at PhD level with the creative engagement and the creative imagination to be able to think through some of the conceptual issues that they're dealing with environmentally and in engineering terms. And I said, this is extraordinary. And he said, no, the same thing is happening at the Indian end of our operation. The people that they're getting to design the new jet engines are people who come from the games industry because they combine traditional disciplined academic skills and understanding with a creative imagination which enables a high-end engineering company like Rolls-Royce to jump into what are conceptually new areas for them. So for universities to be involved in these skills and this part of the economy is something which is not simply fueling games and arts, it's also fueling core activities that go on in our economy. So again, my point is this, that for the role of government may not necessarily be at national level, it can also be at local and regional level. It's thinking through at quite a small scale, almost at a neighborhood scale, how to nurture and grow these industries most effectively. So this comes from a government document produced a couple of years ago, and you can see the vision of Britain in 10 years' time, where the local economies in our biggest cities are driven by creativity. Now this is for a government department to acknowledge that is the centrality of creative industries is extraordinary. Somebody asked me earlier today, I was doing a newspaper interview, he said, but isn't it true that the financial services are more important than the creative industries in the UK? In 2003, the Financial Times newspaper ran an article pointing out that the creative industries in 2003, at the height of the financial services growth in the UK, that creative industries was more important to the UK economy than financial services. And it's also revealed itself to be rather more sustainable. So I think you need to have the data, you need to have the information, but once governments begin to get this as part of their mindset, then you can engage in a radically different way from what has gone before. Now this, I don't know, this kind of analogy makes sense in Latvian, a sort of mixture of carrot and stick to encourage from both ends of the animal. So this is both the carrot and the stick together. And my point in this illustration is to say that there's a very direct way in which government can engage with the creative economy. I've already referred to it in a way. And that is through the use of public procurement. By that I mean what government spends nationally and locally on the goods and services that it buys, whether it's building schools, fixing roads, putting in software systems, running unemployment benefit, building housing, whatever it is, governments are spending very, very substantial amounts of money. And one of the traditions, certainly in our country, has been that very often the public sector does not operate to quite the same high standards that the private sector expects. In other words, government contracts are not as carefully written as private contracts. One of the things that we've been trying to do in the UK is to use the power of government to force up standards environmentally, aesthetically, in terms of cost effectiveness and functionality, to say we can use the spending power of government to help bring about the change in the creative economy. And again, particularly at a time of financial constraint, to argue for how we can get better outcome for public expenditure in key areas of services is absolutely crucial. And very often, that is not a matter of spending more money, it's simply a matter of spending the time to really think through what is the outcome that you want. So my reference to the hospitals earlier on, my reference to some of the things that are going on in schools is a statement of that. In 2005, the government asked Sir George Cox to undertake a review of innovation in business. This was not just for the creative economy, it was right across the whole of British business. He said two main things. One was, he thought it would be a good idea if every business in the UK had some creative practitioners on their board, artists, whatever. But he said we need to have more creative entrepreneurs on boards rather than simply lawyers and bankers, which tend to be the kind of people that appear on boards. But he also said this: we should use the massive powers of procurement to encourage more innovative solutions from suppliers. However constrained any government in the world is, governments have to spend money on goods and services. Thinking through how you can incentivize using that power to come up with creative solutions has got to be something which every government should take seriously and needs to think about. My digital media has crept back into the argument there. Now I want to go on to talk very quickly, and I've nearly got to the end of what I want to say. It's really about how business is adapting to the demands of the creative economy and what I think government can learn from business. This man, Jeff Jarvis, wrote a book, you can see, What Would Google Do?, which was trying to understand the success of Google. And he said, the thing that Google has really been brilliant at doing is it allows its customers to do most of its work for it. In other words, it allows the customers to drive the business. It allows customers to feed back what they think is working, what they think is not working, and they take that on board. They're not afraid of criticism from their customers. If you think about another site, Wikipedia, which is one of the biggest sites on the internet, employs 5 people full-time. Wikipedia is built entirely by its users. It's a voluntary club. In one sense, it's not a business at all, but it is still a core part of the creative economy. And even more, some of the kind of games companies, there's particularly a games company in Britain called Run Escape, when they're designing a new electronic game, instead of spending the money on research and development to get the game to a finished state, they allow their customers to play with half-developed games because they say the customers are much more astute at feeding back to them what is wrong with the game technically and what they think doesn't work with the game creatively. And you could say, well, it's a very smart solution. They're saving themselves a lot of money, and they are saving themselves a lot of money. But in the process, they're turning their customers from customers into associates and members. They're engaging them in the process of creation. And so I come back again to this point that in what's happening in the business world is that the breakdown between provider and consumer is moving quite fast. Big companies like Google are getting used to the idea of engaging their consumers in how they design services. Now, the things I've been talking about here, what's going on in schools? Some of the best content being developed in schools today is being developed by young people themselves. I referred to a project that I'm engaged with kids making films in schools. With a science foundation, we commissioned 6 films from teenage kids about ethical issues around biosciences. Now, you may think a crazy idea, 14-year-old kids making films about ethical issues. A group of Muslim girls in Bradford in the north of England made a film about the ethical issues around xenotransplantation. If you're a Muslim, and you were dying, and there was the option of using a pig's organ to save your life, would you accept it? Good ethical issue, made by 14-year-old kids. They made such a good film that they were able to sell it to a TV network. And the 6 films that were made under that program were all sold to TV networks. My point being that, who would have thought a teacher would not necessarily think that 14-year-olds might be interested in ethical issues around biosciences. But actually, not only are they, but they are capable now, with the technology that's available to them, to make extremely high-quality content that explores those issues. What's happening more and more is that young people are creating the curriculum within schools with their teachers, rather than receiving the curriculum from teachers. My example about health, what was going on there was that artists and entrepreneurs and designers were working with hospital cleaners and patients who traditionally have never been involved in developing these services to develop them. The outcomes are better than anything that has gone on before. The same with digital infrastructure, where government is holding the ring, in other words, setting the platform, if you like, for the debate, and allowing the market to deliver what the market can do best, then you get very good outcomes. Now, my contention is that, dangerous though it may be, we have to start thinking about how we can adopt some of these ideas which the business world is already engaged with in the way that we manage our societies. Now, microphone, crowd of people. Traditionally, the microphone has been used by the politician or the policy developer to address the public. Now, you can turn that around the other way and say, what happens if you engage the audience in addressing the policy thinkers and the politicians? Now, I do not for a moment propose this as a kind of magical solution to governance issues in our society. Of course I don't. But there is a real crisis of democratic legitimacy arising in many of our countries, and it's fueled by many things. One of them is the skepticism that many people have about politicians and the way they work. One of them is a nervousness on the part of government, quite rightly, that if you allow too much free debate, too much engagement from the public, that you will never get significant outcomes, you will never get beneficial outcomes for the society. But I think that one of the things that we need to try to learn from creative business is that if we are going to have systems of governance, I don't just mean government, but systems of governance right across our societies that enable us to develop a more creative approach to the future and to the information society that we're moving into, we have to have the courage to at least try some of these solutions. And so my final point would be this. Now this is intended to be a slightly dangerous and an irritating proposition. But I go back to the beginning and Einstein's point that if I knew what I was doing, I wouldn't call it research. Within some areas, it seems to me that in our societies now, where we have got really serious financial constraints, right across Europe, right across the developed world, for the next 5 years, it's going to take us a long time to dig our way out of the holes that we're in. You have your particular hole in Latvia. We certainly have our particular hole in the UK. We have to find our ways out of that. We're also moving into a time when people's expectation is going up all the time because they have access to information on the internet. It may not be good information, a lot of it may be rubbish, a lot of it may be untrue, but people are engaged by what they find on the internet. How do we deal with that if we are to have a responsible, engaged, democratically accountable society? We have got huge environmental issues coming down the track that mean we cannot go on with the kind of economic model that we've had before. So we have to find creative solutions for that. So my contention would be that in some areas at least, we have to learn how to try to take the risk, and instead of people being asked to trust the policymakers, we have to find ways that make it productive and useful for policymakers to engage with and learn to trust the people. And for me, that is the real lesson of how we have to try and build an effective engagement between the creative economy and a creative government that is fit for the 21st century. So thank you. And now I'm very happy to take some questions. If you do want to ask a question, will you please wait for the microphone to come to you?
What do you believe should be the first priority where the government should boost creativity? In which field? But only one field.
Absolutely no doubt, education. Because I think that if we are not able to rethink the kind of skills that our young people need and the kind of attitudes that people need to have in their approach to work and in their approach to each other, then all the rest of this is not going to work. So without any doubt whatsoever, the place to start is education. That's also, infuriatingly, the area which takes longest to change, and it takes longest to change because, as I was saying, the risks are great in getting it wrong, but we have to move the model of our education system from an industrial model, which was good for the 19th and 20th century, to a creative model which is more fit for the 21st century. So absolutely no doubt, education is the place to start.
Hello, my name is Kristaps and I study biology. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for this speech in which you put education in such an important role. And it seems to me that more and more people today are doing this. Ken Robinson, to name one example, in Britain. And thank you for nurturing this idea. And my question will be about political activism. It is an enormous problem in Europe that youth is not too much involved in politics. They do not express their opinions very often. And what is your opinion how this creative education and giving responsibility to the youth will affect their beliefs and their political activism? Thank you.
Okay, that's a very good question. When I was about 7 years old, for 1 year I went to an American school, and even at the age of 7, we had a class committee with a president, a secretary, a treasurer. And once a week we would sit down and have a class meeting. And the president chaired the meeting, the secretary took the minutes, and the treasurer decided we would make it, okay, Saturday evening, we're all going to go and see a movie. So the treasurer's responsibility was to collect the money, take the money to the cinema, and we all went and paid for it. Now, 7-year-olds. When I started working for the government in the UK and going to cabinet subcommittees, I thought, the people here don't know how to chair meetings. It's a very arrogant thing to say, but you know, and my understanding of how you chair a committee meeting grew from being a 7-year-old in a class and having to accept the discipline of a committee. My point is this, that actually if you start not just playing at some of these things, but actually living them at a very early stage, you learn how to manage political processes. And whatever we may think about many aspects of the American political system, which are not to be envied, that business of instilling citizenship very early on is something which I think has got a huge, powerful resonance, and something which I think we could take very seriously. I don't know, maybe that's the kind of thing that goes on in schools in Latvia. But as a little example of this, a school in London where when about 10 years ago, the idea of having a citizenship element to the curriculum was introduced, one school came up with a great idea that they would constitute themselves as a republic, and the students and the staff would together write a constitution, and they would test the constitution, and they would discuss it, and they would see if there were amendments to the constitution. The staff and students would agree it. I mean, in fact, the system fell apart because when the students who'd invented it left the school, others were not so interested in pursuing it. But I think, we have to come up with creative ideas about how to engage young people in managing their own affairs. And I think if people do learn those sort of lessons about how to work together and collaborate and listen to each other's arguments and share each other's arguments when they're children, it makes it much easier for them to engage responsibly as citizens when they become adults. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does.
Hello, my name name is Pauls. I'm representing Vidzeme Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship here. Question would be, if we talk about creativity or skills of creativity, there are many different methodologies, tools, how to learn creativity. But what do you think are the other skills that go in hand with skills of creativity in order to create those creative businesses that you've been also talking about?
Okay.
Thank you.
I don't think creativity is a skill. I think creativity is something that we all have inherently as children. You see young children, there's almost no such thing as a young child who is not very creative. The problem is, for many of us, the process of growing up and going through the school system means all that creativity gets beaten out of you. I think that the kind of skills that are needed are, in many cases, the traditional skills of business. And that is one of the problems of many of the creative industries, that people who are great creative entrepreneurs, as I was saying at the beginning of my talk, they may not be particularly interested in business. They're interested in what in their personal mission, their creative enterprise. They're not so interested in selling it. And we're spending a lot of time and energy and money in universities in the UK now, and in secondary schools as well, trying to teach business skills, basic business skills, to people who are interested in becoming creative entrepreneurs. That's one way of doing it, but it may be that a better way of doing it is to teach people the social skills so that you can have a proper conversation between the creative entrepreneur and the business entrepreneur, because some people seem to be very good at business, some people are not so good at business. It's very difficult to find somebody who's good at everything. So maybe it's, rather than trying to be good at everything, what you need to learn is how you build the social skills to enable you to say, yes, I would like to work with this person because they have the skills that I haven't got. So you learn about team building. Comes back again, a lot of it is about collaboration and team building. So I think it's also true that there is, and one of the frustrations for government has been that lots of creative entrepreneurs, they're not interested in growing their business. They quite want to stay small. Now that's fine for them. It's very frustrating for government because government wants to see the economy grow. So how you persuade people to expand their businesses and go for scale is a constant issue. But I think that that this idea of promoting hubs which may have a geographical location where entrepreneurs get together, where they work together, they collaborate together. I mean, I work for myself as an individual consultant, entrepreneur, and so on. But I work with other people as well. But we don't bother to form a company. We come together for a project. We do a project, and so on. And I think there are different models of doing these things, of complementing skills. But I think your question, what I take from your question is again, for a government, it's a very serious issue. How do you find ways of marrying the creative skill of the creative entrepreneur with the traditional business skill, which it's necessary to be able to approach an investor with? Because if you can't talk the language of the investor, I mean, plenty of creative entrepreneurs say, oh, the banks are terrible, they don't understand me. Well, if they don't understand you, you have to learn their language just as much as they have to learn your language. It's a two-way street. And I think we do need to find ways of promoting better conversations between traditional business skills and new creative skills.
Hello, my name is Elena, and I study commercial diplomacy. And my question would be, how do you think, is it probably now the end of an era of the traditional industries like only mathematics or construction or technologies, and now the new creative industries would be a mix of these ones? Like, you have to put design in the technologies to be successful, or look at Google, it's a lot of things. Or how do you think? I think the new industries just be the mix of these, and this is the core thing that every successful industry should have, to look around and not just be one thing in it.
Well, I think it's a very good question, because I think that there have been plenty of times in the past when people have believed that convergence of all skills is happening. But if you take the construction industry, you say it's a traditional industry, but my goodness, construction is ceasing to be a traditional industry. It's becoming an extraordinarily high-tech business in which thinking through how you can design and build low-energy buildings, which may be very expensive upmarket offices in Tokyo, New York, London, but they may also be very, very low-tech buildings in other parts of the world where there's no money. I think this, creative engagement in good design, in material science, in using traditional building methods and building materials to deliver better environmental outcomes. There's some of the most exciting work that's going on. And for me, I'd say some of the most creative work that's going on is going on in areas like material science, where testing what we can do with traditional materials and new synthetic materials in the building industry is hugely exciting. And I think you can see buildings coming up around the world which are radically reinventing what we can do with the materials that we know, and radically reinterpreting the whole business of building design by the use of computers. I mean, I don't know if the Gherkin building in London, this kind of strange thing, looks like a huge bullet. One of the engineers working on that said to me, it would be literally impossible to have structured some of the steel members that went into the construction of that building without having very advanced computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacture, because there's no way you could interpret in a conventional way the kind of design requirements and the stress requirements in that building. So what could be more creative than that? It's absolutely using high-end creative skills to deliver a very traditional product, which is a building. And I think that's what I mean about creativity in the economy. It's not just what we choose to define as the creative industries. It's finding creative solutions to everything that we're doing in every area of economic activity. I thought was there another question at the back? No.
I was told that unfortunately we have time limitations, that our guest has scheduled flight already. So I think it's time to thank our speaker, Džona Ņūbigina, for excellent and enlightening lecture. And also I would like to thank our president for bringing Džona Ņūbigina to the university. Thank you.